So I'm thinking I'm going to according to this.
Adrian N. Breitfelder, City Clerk, you are hereby directed to call a special session of the City Council to be held on Monday, October 3rd, 2022 at 5:30 p.m. in the historic Federal Building for the purpose of conducting a work session on the Police Department's Taser implementation.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to a special session of the Dubuque City Council for October 3rd, 2022. As a reminder to viewers and listeners, due to the nature of tonight's meeting topic, public input is not accepted. However, you may contact the City Council directly from the city's webpage at www.cityofdubuque.org/councilcontacts. Attendance for the session is as follows. Mayor Kavanaugh.
Here.
Council members Farber.
Here.
Jones.
Here.
Resnick.
Here.
Roussel.
Here.
Sprank.
Here.
Wethel.
Here.
City Manager Van Milligan.
Here.
And City Attorney Brumwell.
Here.
Thank you. Our work session topic is Police Taser Implementation Update. I will turn it over to Police Chief Jeremy Jensen.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council, Jeremy Jensen, Chief of Police. Also with me tonight is Assistant Chief Joe Meserich and Captain Brad Shannon. Why are they here? Very important. Assistant Chief Meserich did all the research on this, and Captain Shannon is our lead instructor on the Taser. So I can happily report our implementation is complete. As of last week, all officers have been trained, done our initial training with the Tasers. We have them all in. Obviously, we're carrying them now. We see them on the street, and they'll give you a little bit more detail with that as we get into it. But why did we do this? Why is the Tasers? Well, in 2020, you all gave us kind of a directive here to start looking at less lethal options as part of the Black Lives Matter work sessions that we have. So we already had started looking at this. We kicked it into high gear with that and then started looking and did extensive research on it. It just gives us an additional tool. It's a less lethal tool. It gives us another tool that we don't have to jump to a lethal option maybe within that. The other big part of the research we found is that there's less injuries to both the officers and the people we're trying to arrest. So, whoops, I should actually click this on to the next one. Sorry about that. But this is the why. So, with that, we're going to have a little video. So I created a video that went out to our officers and a version that kind of is going out to you all. So we'll play that here. Hi Dubuque, it's Jeremy Jensen, your Chief of Police. I just wanted to talk to you just briefly about a rollout that we have happening here at the Dubuque Police Department. As many of you know, we'll be implementing tasers as part of our less lethal options that the officers will be carrying. This was a council priority to us to look for less lethal options. Now, this isn't the only thing we're doing as part of that. We've done de-escalation, we've added some other things and looked at our training and looked at how we interact with people, which includes our emotional intelligence side of this. But this is another physical tool that gives us a less lethal option. I truly believe in this. So I'm going through the training and I'll be tased as part of that training. And again, the reason, because I want to stand before you and be able to say I've been through it completely and that I truly believe that this is the best option for not only for our officers but for the community. All less lethal options, which like I said included de-escalation, emotional intelligence, and now the Taser, are all part of us better serving you.
Instructors, are you ready?
Ready.
Chief Jensen, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Taser, taser, taser.
Down.
Okay. All right. Just stay where you're at. Stay where you're at. Okay. So, all right.
It does not feel good. I'll just say that straight up front. But it is an option. You saw it, 5 seconds, and it's done. And I'll let them explain, because they're the ones that are going to give you, you've heard me talk about this enough. You need to hear them talk about it. So with that, I'm going to introduce Assistant Chief Joe Meserich.
Good evening. All right, so before I get into the research, we'll talk just a little bit about what a taser is. So a taser is called a conducted electrical weapon, a CEW. So if you see CEW or CED, conducted electrical device, it just means taser. They're all one and the same. And basically what a taser does is it's going to fire 2 darts using compressed gas. Those are going to exit the body of the weapon, and there's going to have wires attached to them. The probes are going to impact on the offender, and then electricity travels between the probes. And that electricity is what causes the incapacitation. So you saw with Chief Jensen, once he was tased, those darts hit, the electricity starts to travel, it causes involuntary muscle contractions, and a lot of them, and he's basically incapacitated, and he's lowered to the ground. So hopefully we can get our person handcuffed while that's going on. We could actually, you saw it in the video, we can actually touch the offender to get the handcuffs on and not get shocked ourselves. So it becomes a really, really good option for us. So the clear benefit, like Chief Jensen mentioned, was obviously our ability to handle some very dangerous situations without having to resort to lethal force. But in doing the research, a much less talked about benefit is just our ability to take highly resistive subjects into custody without hopefully hurting the subject or the officer. And even more, the propensity we have to actually de-escalate the situation altogether. So Captain Shannon, when he gets up here in a little bit, is going to talk about a warning arc. I can actually pull my taser and arc a little bit of electricity, and simply that act alone is a pretty significant deterrent. We're already starting to see that on the street, so kind of a hidden advantage to this system. So our research focused on a couple of different areas. The big ones obviously are offender injury, officer injury, and then what are the risks associated with the taser and how do we mitigate those risks. So as far as the offender injury goes, prior to the tasers, these are the force options we had available to us, right? Bodily force, which is for the most part physical strength. I want to put your arm behind your back. You don't want it to go there, so you resist, and we try. It's a wrestling match basically, or it could be punches, strikes, kicks, things like that. Then pepper spray, striking instruments, different types of munitions, chemical or impact, and then obviously deadly force. So taser gives us another force option to kind of put in there to help us control these subjects. If you look at these different options, the majority of them, other than pepper spray, have a much higher propensity for causing injury than the taser does. So again, that's why it makes it such an attractive option for us. And then finally down below here, we do a use of force analysis at the end of every year, and we look at what force we're using, what injuries that we're sustaining, what injuries the offenders sustain. And in our latest analysis, the 2021 numbers, 67% of the time we're going hands-on, we're using that bodily strength. And that number was identical to 2020, it was also 67% of the time. So it's by far and away physical strength or personal bodily force is our most used force option. The problem with that is it's also the force option that causes the most injuries, both towards the officer and the offender. And it's not just our numbers that are showing us that. When we did the research and looked at some of the nationally funded studies, we found that their numbers were basically the same. But once a taser, or you can see in this study, it refers to it as a CED, once that's introduced, you start to see a fairly significant drop then in the injuries because you're no longer in that wrestling match, right? You're no longer having to use strikes and some of those other options. So in this particular study, they found in totality, taser use basically dropped their suspect injuries by about 70%. One of their larger agencies, Miami, right, that's a huge drop, almost 90%. Now, I would call that 90% an outlier compared to some of the other ones, but it's still, those are pretty significant numbers that we were starting to see. Here's kind of a local case for you, another to show you kind of the why. So I'd like you to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the officers that respond to this call. This is a 2016 case, and while injuries like this luckily are rare, this type of situation is not. These are the types of things that our officers find themselves in fairly frequently. So this was a domestic assault type of case. Officers respond to a male-female disturbance. They arrive, they encounter the male, he's uncooperative, he's physically resistive, punches one of our officers in the head, and it takes 4 of our officers to subdue this person, even after he's pepper sprayed, right? So pretty good struggle. And it's tough, right? If you want to take somebody into custody that doesn't want to go there, it's a very difficult thing to do. It's not as easy as they make it look on TV. So unfortunately, our officer in this case gets injured. He gets a torn labrum. You can kind of see the figures there, about $17,000 for the medical claim itself, so the cost of the surgery. That officer had 75 lost days of work, and then another 82 light duty or restricted duty days, right? And this is just the dollars and cents. It's not, the loss of that officer's arm to him and the hobbies he couldn't do and the things with his family he was unable to do, right? But when you look at the totality of what this probably cost us with lost time and the injury claim, we're up a little over $53,000, not counting the overtime to backfill that officer's shift. So these injuries not only have a significant emotional toll on our officers, but also a pretty decent financial toll as well. So officer injury reduction is huge for us, especially when we're looking at this research here. And again, the research kind of shows that when your officers are going hands-on and using that physical strength, the chances of them getting injured are high. But when we introduce taser, the chances of those injuries start to drop. So this was another major metro study. They did Orlando and Austin. Orlando, 60% decrease in officer injuries. Austin's not quite as dramatic, but 25%, I would take a 25% reduction in injury any day of the week. That's still a great number. So that's kind of what the research was showing us. It's overall a fairly safe device, and it's been shown to reduce injuries kind of across the board. But it doesn't come without any risks, right? So how do we mitigate those risks? Basically, we kind of focused on three different things: policy, training, and supervision. So we're an accredited agency through CALEA. We reached out to other accredited agencies. Please send us your TASER policies so we can review them. And then we sat down with all 10 of our instructors, including Captain Shannon, reviewed those policies and drafted our own to make sure we're following the best practices out there, both with the training that they received and accreditation standards. So once we had our our policy in place, we then rolled out our training, and Captain Shannon will be talking about that at length, but we trained our entire police department on the use of the TASER, the legality of it, policy considerations, things like that. And then finally, the supervision. So any use of force event for the Dubuque Police Department goes through 2 reviews. All officers have to do a use of force report to document that force. TASER is included in that, both the display of the TASER and the use of it. So if I pull my TASER and I just display that warning arc like we talked about before, that's going to go on a report just like it would if I actually fired the device, right? That report then gets reviewed by my immediate supervisor, and then it goes through a second review by Captain Pace, our professional standards captain. So 2 levels of review like everything else. So if we do start to see any issues with the use of the device, we can add some more training to the mix and get things fixed. Any questions? All right, thank you.
Mayor, City Council, my name is Brad Shannon. I'm a captain with the police department, and I'm the lead TASER instructor. So really what I'm going to do here tonight is I'm going to talk about the implementation of the training. And this training actually all got started on July 5th this past summer. And trust me, I don't remember this date because it's in my PowerPoint, but I remember this date because that's also the day that I also got voluntarily exposed. And I actually remember July 4th, that holiday, just thinking to myself, am I really going to do this the next day? But in a little bit, I'll tell you about that voluntary exposure, and I'll tell you how this actually impacts your body. But with the training date on July 5th, we had a master instructor come down to the police department, and he is from the Polk County Sheriff's Department. He spent a full day with 10 of our officers to certify 10 of us as instructors. And there was approximately about 4 hours of coursework material that we had to complete before this training day. But when he came in, he basically trained us for a full day. And once that training session was completed, we were then tasked with basically instructing the rest of our department. So there's 10 of us right now on the department that are certified as TASER instructors, and it's from all ranges of officer level, corporal level, lieutenant level, and captain level as well. Since the rollout of the TASER, they were full day training sessions. So again, they were a full 10-hour training day, and this training began late July, and it went all the way through late August. And again, it was a full-hour training day. We had 2 instructors for every class, and we wanted to keep the class size small, so we kept it to about 4 to 6 officers. Because this was a brand new tool, a new device that we were going to be training our instructors to, we wanted to keep the instructor to officer very, very small so that we could give a lot of attention to those officers, because we just knew that there was going to be a lot of questions to be asked. And as of to this date, we've had 93 officers that have been certified. This does not include the officers that are currently on extended leave or at the police academy today. For certification, the user has to be certified every calendar year. So just because they got certified this last July and August, this certification is good for 1 year. So every calendar year, the officers are going to have to get recertified. With that certification, they're going to have a minimum of 6 hours instructional time. There's also a written examination that they have to pass as well, and that passing score is a 90%. There's also another functional testing that they have to do. So like firearms, we got to show proficiency when we're shooting our firearms. Same thing with the TASER. We got to show proficiency when we're also deploying the TASER. So the officers have to show demonstration of shooting close range and further back as well, while stationary and while moving back and forth. And then there's also scenario-based training as well that they have to go through. This last training session, we had 5 scenarios that we had the officers go through, and this all stems from, you might just have de-escalation or verbal judo, you might have deploying the TASER, and then you might have the deadly force as well. So there's a number of force options in this training scenarios that we use, so that's another portion of the instruction that we also give as well. So for our training day and how this all started, when the officers came in for training, we started with an hour-and-a-half presentation on the PowerPoint. This was nothing but more than a general basic overview of what the Taser is. They actually got their Taser issued to them. They went over the nomenclature, and again, just basic user information. Once that PowerPoint was over, we jumped right into the voluntary exposures. And for the 93 officers that have been certified so far, 40 officers decided to do the voluntary exposures. Some people ask the question, my God, why would you do this if it's not required? Because in reality, it's not required of you to do this. It's strictly, if the officer wants to volunteer, it's up to them. But what I will tell you that for myself, I also did the voluntary exposure as well, and for the reasons that I did it are a lot of reasons why the officers do it as well. The first reason is credibility as an instructor. If I'm an instructor, and if I'm going to be responsible for tasing the other officers, I also want to be able to explain to them and say, this is what it's going to feel like, and really, I know, because I had it done to myself as well. The other credibility part is when officers are being tased, you have spotters on each side, and those spotters guide the officers down when they're being tased, like you saw the video, and that instills a real strong sense of confidence in the officers that they can actually go hands-on with the person and not be zapped or not be tased. Additionally, for me, which was really important, was for court documentation purposes. If I go to court, if I deploy my Taser on somebody, and if I'm actually in court being questioned about my use of force judgment, I want to have that firsthand experience as well. So there's more credibility to my testimony. When we did the voluntary exposures, we had a safety plan that was implemented. So we had mats that we put down, we had spotters on each side of the officer, everybody had the eyeglasses on at the same time, and we also had medics from the fire department also in the same room as well, just in case there's any kind of medical complication that resulted afterwards, and I'm glad to say that we had no problems whatsoever. When you get tased, it's 5 seconds. Law enforcement language, we say you took the ride for 5 seconds, or you were energized for 5 seconds. But it's a 5-second burst, and the only way that I could really describe it to somebody that hasn't been tased is if you've ever been woken up in the night with a really bad Charlie horse, like in your hamstring or your calf, times that by 50, but put it through your entire body, and that's what it feels like. It just feels like every muscle is just contracting so hard that you are literally just incapacitated. And that's what's so nice for us, because when we charge somebody and deploy the Taser, they are not able to fight us. Their muscles are contracting. We are then able to go hands-on and then get them in custody. Less injury to us and less injury to them as well. So after the voluntary exposure was finished, then we did a written examination. And again, the officers had to pass with a written score of 90%, which they all passed. And then we spent significant time with the belt setup. You know, for me, having 20 years on the department, carrying another tool or another device on my belt is completely new to me, and it kind of scares me a little bit because, you know, for my firearm, everything is muscle memory. So when I'm under stress and I have to react, I just react. My fine motor skills have been conditioned to that point to just, that's where my pistol is, this is my motion to get it, and that's how I'm going to react. So when you bring a new tool to the table, you have to be able to condition your body, your mind, and your fine motor skills to react to something. So we spent significant time letting the officers decide where they wanted to put that Taser on them. You can see right now I have a vest on, an exterior weight vest, and I chose to carry my Taser on my vest. That's my personal preference. Some officers, Chief Jensen, he has his on his duty belt. So we give the officers a preference on where they want to carry them. But again, we spent significant time allowing the officers just to get comfortable with unholstering, coming up and aiming that Taser, just to get those fine motor skills tuned up for doing that. Then we spent significant time discussing our policy, our Taser policy that Assistant Chief Meserich just touched on a little bit ago. So some key points that I'm just going to go over here real quickly on our Taser policy. For an officer to use the Taser, they have to have a reasonably perceived threat. We don't want the officers to have to go hand on and actually engage in physical confrontation before they use the Taser. So an example that I can give you is if I responded to a domestic disturbance call, and let's say I have half the people are coming outside the house, they're rushing at me, they have their hands clenched, and they're telling me that they're going to punch me or assault me. At that point in time, I have a reasonably perceived threat that my life is going to be in jeopardy, so I can use a Taser. It doesn't mean that somebody has to go hands-on with me and start physically assaulting me before I actually deploy my Taser. So again, reasonably perceived threat is very important, and we touched on that very importantly with the officers. Additionally, where we carry our Tasers are also very, very important. We understand in law enforcement, there's risks to everything that we do. I mean, everything that we do. So to mitigate the risk, what we chose to do is we're carrying our Taser on our support side of our body. So my strong side of my body would be the side of my body that I have my pistol on. Taser will be my support side, which is my left side. The reason being is because we all know that there's been accidental discharges with pistols when the officer thought they deployed their taser. So when you have your taser on the opposite side or the support side of your body, that motion is completely different than the motion that you have when you go to reach for your pistol. So you're reaching across your body, and that is one reason why it's support side. So me, I carry my taser support side of my vest, or you'll have an officer on the support side, just the opposite side of where the firearm is. Additionally, per policy, once we unholster the taser, the officer has to physically and visually look to make sure that it was a taser that they actually unholstered and not their pistol. The nice thing about the tasers, they look nothing like our pistols. They weigh nothing like our pistols. They're very much lighter and they're bright yellow, but that's one extra step that we want to take to make sure that, yes, we are in fact now unholstering our taser, not our pistol. We also want to allow a reasonable amount of time for the offender. So if I deploy my taser on somebody, it's a 5-second ride, they're energized for 5 seconds. Those who've been tased understand and know for those 5 seconds, I'm not hearing anything that's going around me. I'm not hearing nothing. My sensory is just overloaded. I'm not hearing, I'm not seeing nothing. So when that 5 seconds of energizing is over from the taser, the officer has to have a reasonable amount of time to see if the suspect is going to comply with those commands. So if I tase somebody and now my energizing of 5 seconds is over, I'm going to give this person commands to put your hands behind your back, stop resisting. Give them a reasonable amount of time, because if I just give them one command and I decide to give them another 5 seconds, that's unnecessary, because reasonably, this person's not going to be able to comprehend exactly what I'm saying. So just giving them the reasonable amount of time to basically comply with what my instructions are. Also, we use caution with sensitive populations. So there are people that are more prone to injury when being tased. You know, those people are going to be the pregnancies, the very elderly, children, and people with very, very low body mass. Now, per policy, it doesn't say that we can't tase these individuals. The likelihood that there's going to be more serious to injury if this population is tased is going to be greater. So we want to basically let the officers understand and know that this is a sensitive population, and that if you do choose to tase one of these individuals, there is a very good chance that there's going to be injury to that. So again, pregnancy, the very elderly, very low body mass, and children as well. Question comes up is, can we use a taser for, do the SROs carry tasers in schools? And I'll tell you, yes. Every officer that is certified is going to carry those tasers. With that being said, I'm just going to say something real quickly. I was in the SRO unit about a year ago, and I'll tell you that these officers do a phenomenal job with de-escalating and not having to use their tools. But in all reality, if a situation arose inside of a school, if the officer was justified to deploy a taser, the SROs do carry those as well. Also, we want to avoid tasing people from high falls or explosives. We've all seen videos of an officer maybe tasing somebody on an overpass on an elevated highway. When you tase somebody, you cannot break your fall. So we do not want to be tasing somebody if somebody's on a second-story balcony or on an overpass on a highway, because if they get tased, they are going to be falling. And obviously, the greater the fall, the higher risk of injury. And then with explosives, we do not want to be deploying our taser if there's anything near explosive near or around us. Also, supervisory notification. So when we deploy a taser, the officer should quickly as possible, as reasonably as soon as possible, notify their supervisor so that the supervisor can either respond to the scene and start that initial investigation, but that notification to a supervisor should be done as soon as possible as well. Real quickly, I'd just like to touch on the use of force policy, and Assistant Chief Mesrich kind of touched on this. But with the use of force policy, the taser is literally right after OC spray. So when you have a continuum of force options for us, at the very bottom you have officer presence, you have de-escalation. At the very far end you have deadly force. But at the bottom, when you have your officer presence, and then you have soft hands where I might just have to grab somebody and pick them up, then I can go into OC spray. Taser is right after OC spray. And the reason for that is there is 3 levels of resistance that an officer can encounter out on the field. Passive, active, and assaultive, okay? When you have a passive resistive individual, we cannot deploy a taser. This is somebody who maybe just be protesting and maybe they're just sitting down, but our use of force is nothing more than just picking this person up, putting handcuffs, and putting them in a car. When you have an active resistance person, this is somebody that is actively trying to pull away from you, trying not to let you take them into custody. And when this happens, OC spray is authorized as well as Taser, because we don't want to have the officers go on a hand-to-hand combat with somebody before they can deploy the Taser. So when you have an active resistance individual who's actively resisting you, pulling away, not letting you take them into custody, Taser can be deployed at that point in time per our policy. After this, we went to lunch, and then we did some live fire drills. And with the live fire drills, with the Taser, we have 2 cartridges that we have inside of our Taser. There's a close quarter cartridge, and then there's a standoff cartridge. Most of the deployments of Taser, 85% actually, are within 12 feet. So the majority of the time, the officer is going to be up close and personal with somebody when they have to deploy that Taser. But there's also times where maybe the officer can get some distance, and you want to have that reactionary gap, and now they're going to have to deploy that Taser from a further distance. So the officers had to successfully deploy 4 cartridges from various distances, anywhere from 4 feet to 8 feet to 12 feet to 20 feet. And they had to do this at a stationary target. And this target is actually right here in your PowerPoint. So if you see this target, this is the target that they're shooting at. This is a full-size target, 6 foot high. It's going to basically resemble an adult male. But this is what they'd be utilizing to actually deploying their Tasers. And if you see the green area, that is your preferred striking areas. That is the preferred area that you want to strike with the Taser. Head, neck, chest, groin is completely off limits. We should not be trying to strike those areas with our Tasers. The biggest and the most beneficial areas for us to hit with the Taser is the large muscle mass body areas. Preferably is the back. Back has the biggest muscle groups, and when you get the larger muscle groups involved, when the dart hits those muscle groups, more incapacitation. So again, head, neck, chest, and the groin areas off limits. You might ask, well, why is the chest off limits? Chest has a large muscle group, but it's also closer to the heart. So we want to keep the darts as furthest away from the heart as possible. And just to touch on this for a little bit, there's always questions of, well, can the Taser cause any kind of cardiac arrest? There have been studies, and it's so infrequent, and I think the last study that I read was it's about 1 in 100,000 deployments of a Taser that you might have a cardiac arrest issue from. And the number one thing that would be responsible for that is dart to heart ratio. So they found the closer the dart was to the heart, the increases the chance of some kind of cardiac arrest issue that you might have. So that's why the chest is off limits for us. So again, preferred striking areas is anything not in the yellow. So lastly, when the officers demonstrated proficiency with moving to and from and striking these stationary targets, the last thing we had them do was the de-escalation drills and the scenario-based training. With the scenario-based training, as an instructor, I will tell you, I think this is the best type of training that you can have, because what it does is it simulates stress for the officer, and it makes the officer react to rapidly unfolding events very quickly and using a force option based on those scenarios. So with our scenario-based training, we had 5 scenarios that we used. And again, they ranged from just officer presence to de-escalation to just de-escalating the situation based on their verbal skills, all the way to deploying the Taser, and then all the way to actually going to deadly force as well. So with this training, what we had the officers do, we had them do jumping jacks, we had them run, and the reason being is because in a training environment, the officers know that they're safe. But the only way that we can mimic some kind of stress is to elevate that heart rate and get that blood flowing going. So that's one thing that we did. So once that was finished, the officers got a little exercise, and then they came in the room and we gave them 5 scenarios back to back. And they were quick and they were efficient. And then once those scenarios were over, we would debrief with those officers and talk about, hey, what went really well and what are some things that we can improve on as well. In this picture here, this is a photograph of the role player that we would have, and they would actually be wearing a training suit. So the role player would be actually wearing this suit that you're seeing right here, and it allowed us to use training cartridges, you know, the same exact thing that we're going to be deploying on the street, but they're training cartridges, and we had a chance to actually deploy those at the role player. The nice thing about a role player is that a role player is not stationary either. And out in the field, things just don't stay stationary. Things are constantly moving. So the officers really develop a sense of confidence with their proficiency in discharging the Taser and their confidence on hitting the preferred target areas that they had to hit as well. I will tell you that as a Taser instructor, the one thing that kind of I didn't understand initially was how a taser could be used for de-escalation. I always thought this was just kind of an offensive tool that we had, but not realizing how this could actually use for de-escalation. And I will tell you that to date, and Assistant Chief Messer kind of touched on this a little bit, officers, if they have a perceived threat and they unholster their taser and they give what we call the warning arc, and what that is your cartridge in front of your taser is being energized. You can visually and audibly hear that electricity flowing. And we employed that in these scenarios as well. And I will tell you that since we started this training in July, we've had 8 incidents fully documented already to this point on tasers being unholstered and utilized as a de-escalation factor, where we didn't deploy the taser, but we either unholstered it and we gave a warning arc to a suspect. And out of those 8, 5 actually resulted in getting compliance from our offender, where we didn't actually have to go hands-on or fight with that person, so we got compliance. 3 out of the 8, it didn't work, but 5 out of the 8 did. And I know this is a small database that we're using right now for statistics, but I'm happy to see those numbers right now. And I will also tell you that we had 2 deployments of the taser so far. 1 deployment was successful, and 1 deployment was not successful. And the reason why the 1 deployment was not successful is because the dart didn't actually hit the suspect, only 1 did. So when you tase somebody, both of those darts that come out of the taser, both of them have to hit the body. If only 1 hits the body, you're not going to get that arc current that's going to flow through the body, incapacitate them. So it's also very important that you have both of those hit. And if the mayor and council, if you guys don't mind, I can unholster my taser and I can show you that warning arc so you can visually and audibly see what that is, if you guys don't mind.
Go ahead.
You guys okay with it?
Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
So again, if I'm going to a call and I have somebody that's approaching me, he's got his fist balled up and he wants to assault me or strike me, I can just hit this warning arc. And I could just give him a warning that you're going to be tased. Back down or you're going to be tased. And I can let this go as long as I want to, but from this position, I could obviously come up and deploy it if I had to, but this is the warning arc. So they get a chance to see it, hear it, and then they make the determination of whether or not that they want to actually continue with that level of resistance or comply as well. Lastly, I will tell you that this is an ongoing training. It's not like we can just give an officer a 10-hour training day and expect them to be professionals and experts in this weapon system. So the one thing that we're still doing is doing ongoing training with those officers. We have lineup training, and I'm trying to implement this where we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes with the officers. We'll bring them to a secure area, and we'll practice unholstering the tasers and just getting comfortable with that movement. And then also we have departmental firearms training that we have currently going on right now, and we've actually are incorporating taser with our departmental firearms training. So going from deadly force to maybe less lethal force with the taser, or going to the taser to a deadly force situation. And again, getting officers more custom, confident, and proficient with understanding where those weapon systems are on their body.
This is all part of a bigger picture. So we received a grant from NICC to do use of force training. So we're bringing all of our force options under an umbrella. And so we can, historically, they've been siloed in different things. Firearms, you go out and do firearms training. You go do defensive tactics training. You do ASP training. You do taser training. Now we're bringing that all under one umbrella. So we're going to have pretty much everybody go through a training on use of force holistically, and then also we're going to be training instructors on that. So this is going to be an ongoing thing. Again, bringing this all together, like Captain Shannon said, we're actually doing this as part of our firearms now and that kind of thing. Those of you that went through the Virtua system, this would be another option within that we can do things with that to say, okay, is this an option we could do instead of that? And so working through it. Very fluid situations. It may not be the answer, but again, it gives the officers another tool to do that. And that ends our presentation. Again, I thank you all for approving this in last year's budget, and we, like I said, just got it done here in first week in September. Do we have any questions?
Open it up for questions, yeah. Mr.
Mayor,
Resnick.
thank you, and I appreciate your presentation, and you really know the gravity of the situation, and I'm glad that you don't call it non-lethal. It is less lethal, like the officer had said many times, because they mentioned about the 8 cardiac arrests or so that I've heard about, but also this study here says that it contributed to over 500 deaths since 2010. So it's serious stuff, and I'm glad to see that you're taking it seriously. Some of the objections to its use is that there's a lack of uniform state and national standards, and you mentioned that too, and that we want to do best practices. And they also say that sometimes in the heat of things, officers might use a taser as a punishment for something, the abuse that they're taking. And I know you probably guard against that. It's hard to keep your emotions under control. But I love it that you have a yearly certification. My question, is certification required of every police officer or just those? Is every police officer carrying a taser?
Yes, all sworn police officers have gone through the training and will be carrying the taser. Yeah.
So they're all required to and keep up their certification. Are you bundling the certification with everything else that you mentioned at the end?
Well, and that depends on how we roll out the training and the timing of it. But the certification itself is not necessarily use of force training, but more to be certified to use it. So we'll see how that goes as we, again, the time of year and how we do that. But yeah, I mean, the use of it will be part of the totality of the use of force thing. So not necessarily the certification, but the actual use of it and how we use it, when we use it, and particularly, as Captain Shannon said, under stress, how we're using it.
And you talked about the fluidity of the situation. The study mentions that only one out of three officers have been trained about how to switch between, as the situation changes, a taser situation, or is it a firearm situation, or put it away. Is that part of our training that we do here?
Yes, that's what we're doing with our firearms training right now. That is one of the scenarios that they're working through, is when to drop it or when to stay with it. And again, there's so many nuances with that, but the idea is to get it into your mind that I can do that. I'm not stuck with one or the other, so to speak. Or I could put my handgun away and go to the taser. You escalate up, escalate down. There's the ability to do that.
Super, glad to hear that. I believe I'm paraphrasing, but I believe he said that the active resistors are more dangerous to officers. But what I read is that best practices in other areas bar the use of use on passive or fleeing subjects. So what I heard was we might want to use that before they're less than passive or they are fleeing. How's that going to be working?
Yeah, passive is, as Captain Shannon said, it's just somebody who's just essentially sitting there. I'm not going to jail. They're not actively, physically doing anything. So we don't use it on that. There's dangers with people running, because you saw what happened to me. You lock up. You're running, you're going to lock up. So there's not a never, but it's one of these things where we're like, we really don't want to do that. So there might be a situation where that has to happen, where we're trying to apprehend somebody that's a bigger danger to the public. Deadly force may not it, but we don't want them to be with that. So there may be a situation, but we really kind of discourage it. Just somebody running away, don't tase them. Don't use the taser on them. Yeah.
So it's in our policy, and we discuss it with the officers, that stand alone, somebody that just runs from a police officer, we're just standing alone, just running from us with no other situation behind it, we're not going to tase them. But with that being said, we can't say always. So we always tell the officers it always depends on totality of the circumstances. And maybe an example I'll give you is maybe we had a homicidal suspect that has a firearm, and now he's running away from us. He's a threat to the community, a threat to other people, and that deploying a taser in that kind of circumstance would obviously be justified. But a standalone, just having somebody run from us from maybe a traffic stop or a public intoxication type of arrest, if they're just going to run from us, we're telling our officers that no, this isn't a justifiable taser deployment. There's got to be other circumstances to it that involve the threat to the public. If that answers that question for you.
Yes, thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to read something. The Iowa chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union is concerned because of the lack of statewide requirements, and they asked the state legislature in Iowa to do that. I would think that if they did that, it'd be kind of a minimum of because you guys have higher standards than perhaps, but I just wanted to say a lot of people are concerned with the use of tasers, and it's encouraging to me to hear that you're taking things so seriously and getting everybody trained. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Sprink.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Technical questions. So, yeah. So you mentioned how you missed, how a dart didn't actually take, or whatever the actual, what's the term when it actually hits somebody? Is there an actual term?
If we just say it deploys and hits the preferred
Okay,
target,
okay.
yeah.
So if you're farther back, 20 feet, do the darts actually spread, or do they continue to go in a straight line? Or-
So when we are at a distance further back, we actually go to what's called a standoff cartridge. And we have a close counter cartridge and a standoff cartridge. And the angles are shifted differently between those cartridges just for that reason. So if we're farther back or we're close up, depending on how the angle of that cartridge is, close counter, or if it's standoff, that's how it's supposed to be deployed, because the Taser has two lasers to it, a red and a green. So when we put our Taser and we point it at somebody, we're going to see those laser darts, but depending on what cartridge we have is going to put it on the preferred target area. So if I am at a 20 feet distance and if I have my close counter cartridge up with my lasers, I'm not going to be on my preferred target area. I can basically just what's called a switch, where I just flip my Taser like this, and it will switch between my cartridges, and then at that point in time, my standoff cartridge will have my lasers targeted to that preferred target area. So we have the ability to switch depending on the distance that we're at, if that answers your question for you.
And they do spread.
And then a couple of maintenance questions, so to speak. I remember when we first discussed this back around the budget time, was that that they get updated every year, that's part of our agreement with Taser. So if you have to deploy them, can you recharge them, or what's the, 2 charges, 5 charges, or how many times can they actually be deployed?
So every Taser has a battery, and that battery has to be switched out every 30 days. And that doesn't specifically mean because the battery's down to a 0% charge. It's because there's a software update that we want to keep. So if you picture about a battery, think about that battery as being the computer system inside the Taser. So we basically switch out the battery. So if we deploy a Taser, the first thing I'll do as a supervisor is I'll take that battery out and I'll put it in the docking station. And then what's going to do, it's going to log all that information onto an evidence database that we can then review. It's going to let us know, how long that charge was for, how many charges happened. So it gives us all that evidentiary value information that we need to know about that specific tasing. And then once that is over, we just give the officer a new battery, and then that Taser is functional and ready to go again.
And we do that if we deploy the Taser. We'll download it right then.
One last question, I promise. So you displayed the Taser or the arc warning. Can that actually be used in close proximity on someone? If you actually had to use, without deploying the Taser.
Okay, so
say you had to actually just say you're,
Sure. So it's called a drive stun, and I will tell you that currently right now we are not certified on using it. It's another option that we're looking at exploring, but when we got our initial certification, we were not certified on using that with the Taser. It is a function that we do have, but there is a little bit more research that myself, Assistant Chief Mesrich, is going to do to maybe see if we will implement that. But it is an option, but right now we have not certified and trained officers are doing it, so at this point we are not doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor? Oh.
Ms. Farber.
Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. I have a legal liability question. So if you were to tase someone in that scenario you said where they were running and there weren't police person on each side to catch them, and there was some injury to that person, how does are we liable for potential injury there?
First, let me just answer that. All force, we have to justify our force. So we have to walk through that. Now, granted, we can be sued for any force we use, but I'll let Krenna answer the liability side of it.
So what Jeremy said is correct, but every case like that is going to have a uniqueness to it based on the totality of the circumstances as they've outlined. So if something like that presented itself, we would review it, and we would review it in terms of our policy. So for example, anytime there's a use of force incident now, if it comes up in litigation, what we look at are all of the circumstances in that situation. We compare it to our policy and we look at whether we comply. If we're compliant with our policy, it limits liability in some circumstances, but it is going to be very unique.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Ms. Russell.
Thank you. I had a question about, in the video, it showed you holding on to Chief Jensen as he was being tased. So does the charge stay only within the body of the person being tased? So it wouldn't matter if you touched the person?
As long as you don't touch between the darts. So,
Okay.
yeah, that it doesn't. So people holding on to me didn't feel it at all, and I was feeling it, and so that's one of the benefits of it, is that we're able to do that, enable, again, why somebody's in that 5 seconds, take them into custody without any further physical resistance, because they're incapacitated, we can take them into custody, and hopefully within that.
Thank you.
Jones.
It's probably about 35 years ago, we were using a handheld device called a stun gun, which was like a stationary taser. It could only be used in drive mode, where you had to make contact with the subject, and I had to do a fair amount of research on the potential side effects / dangers of that device. And the cardiovascular one seems like the real obvious one, but and I've stayed with the literature because I was still am an emergency medical services educator, and have stayed on the literature. And that incidence of cardiac injury is closer to the 1 out of 100,000. Incidence of cardiac arrest is more like 1 out of 1,000,000 in most of what I've read. 1 out of 100,000, you might have an arrhythmia briefly that resolves either with or without treatment. You might have other things. But, and of course, paramedics are concerned about, as the flying dart taser was invented and came into service in different areas, what if it hits in an eye? What if it hits there? Well, if it hits in an eye, we pull the dart out. Wherever it hits, you pull the dart out in your treatment. It's the incidence of physical trauma from the penetration of the darts is also next to none. So who's really getting tased in law enforcement across the world? And mostly it's people that otherwise would maybe get shot. And that's what I absolutely like about the taser. And I love the thoughtful process that you've come up with, that you're going to require that it's cross-drawn, which is way different from the motor memory that gets your weapon out of your holster and downrange at the target. So that's a whole different thing to have to cross-draw. I like the design is yellow. I like that it doesn't feel like a gun. And I like the thoughtful process that got you there. So I truly think you're doing everything right, and you're making a good choice here, and I think these will save lives, hands down. I'm a member of the ACLU, and I'm proud of that. And I don't speak for them, but I understand their concern, and their concern is that every police department isn't this one. Their concern is that there are some 1- and 2-person operations. Hey, here's your taser, Joe, try not to shoot yourself in the foot. And that's the training. And those law enforcement officers still exist out there. They're smaller and smaller and smaller in numbers as the professionalism of the profession grows. But I think that's the concern, is that the thoughtful choices aren't being made, that the research isn't done. And I think you've done an outstanding job of researching the possibilities, researching the product, researching the scenarios, and building a training program that's going to keep our officers safe, keep the suspects and subjects that are being detained and arrested safer, and reduce injury on both sides of the badge. So congratulations and thank you. This is just what I'm looking for in law
And this is my plug for being CALIA certified. I mean, to have that ability, to have that oversight, and to have that outreach, and you all keep approving that for us, and we thank you for that.
Yeah, Ms. Buffa.
A comment first, and then I think a question. So the comment being, you described the 2016 episode in which the officer was injured, the number of days off work, the financial cost. But I think there's a measurable loss when someone goes through an injury in the middle of a traumatic event that we can't put a number on. And so both for the officer and for the individual who may or may not be about themselves making the decision they're making in that moment. And so I think there's so much to consider in what this does to prevent things that we can't document. And as a healthcare provider, I can just see that this is something we can't measure, but important to consider. As far as injuries sustained by individuals who have been tased, is there a protocol following this for a medical assessment, and how many of those individuals have needed to be taken to an emergency room?
So with our policy for right now, anytime we deploy a taser, we are going to basically have medical respond. So Dubuque Fire will respond, and they will do an evaluation of the patient. I would tell you that the officers, when they get the certification, they are trained to remove the darts from the individual. If the darts were to hit a sensitive area or not a preferred target area, we ourselves as officers would not remove those. We would basically have the suspect transported to the hospital and have an ER physician do that. But as of now, as it stands per policy, medical personnel will respond every time that we deploy a taser.
Right.
The one we had, he refused, right?
And so the one deployment that we had that was a successful deployment, medical was obviously on scene, but the person was not cooperative and was not being compliant. But regardless of how it works, we still want to try to get the medical to respond to do an initial assessment to make sure that they're okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, Mr. Jones.
Just one other comment as well about officer safety. We talked about the loss of time and loss of dollars in that officer injury. Now, if that officer had been able to use a taser, there might not have been an officer injury. But if the officer couldn't use a taser and it got worse and had to resort to deadly force, how many officers have their lives totally changed because they took a life in the line of duty? And that's something that we all want to avoid too. The harm to that, you could have years of loss of use of that officer. You could have people change careers. You could have all kinds of terrible brain health outcomes from that. So it's not something that your team takes lightly. I know that because I've been in the virtual simulator with most of them and seen how good they are and how thoughtful they are about what they're doing there. But that's a real consideration too, that we're going to save somebody the grief of having to take a life.
Any other questions? All right. Well, Chief, Assistant Chief, and Captain, thank you so much for being here. I think we've really appreciated this discussion. I know those are some very thoughtful questions we had for you too, but I also very much appreciate this being a public discussion. So it's out there for everyone in Dubuque to see and be able to hear about and understand this a little bit more as to what we're trying to do. So thank you very much for your work and thanks for this presentation. And there being no further business in the work session, we will be adjourned.
Muted.